February 17, 1944, Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. The Pacific is silent, too silent. Dawn light spills over the turquoise water, glinting off rusted anti-aircraft barrels and anchored ships swaying in lazy rhythm. Japanese sailors yawn awake on deck, sipping rice tea, unaware that history is about to erase them from the map. Far beyond the horizon, engines hum, not a few, but hundreds. The deep rolling thunder of aircraft fills the morning sky. Radar operators inside concrete bunkers squint at glowing screens. Blips appear, then more. Then too many to count. Panic ripples through the garrison. The alarm bell screams across the island. Kogeki! Kogeki! Attack! Moments later, the horizon erupts in motion. Dozens of F-6F Hellcats slice through the clouds, followed by Avenger bombers and dive-bombing Helldivers in perfect formation. For the first time, the Japanese defenders glimpse the full scale of America's vengeance. An armada of steel and fire, controlled with mechanical precision. From the east, Carrier Task Force 58 has arrived, and nothing in the Pacific will ever be the same again. By the beginning of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The early years of Japanese dominance, from the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor to the sweeping conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, were fading into memory. The tide had turned. The defeat at Midway in June 1942 had shattered Japan's carrier force. 4 of its elite fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the sea, along with many of its most experienced pilots. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was a wound that would never truly heal. The months that followed were a brutal stalemate. Guadalcanal became a graveyard of men and machines, a test of endurance that exposed Japan's logistical limits. By early 1943, the Japanese were retreating island by island, their once proud navy increasingly forced into defense. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, America had begun to unleash the full might of its industrial revolution at war. Shipyards along the coasts of California, Washington, and Virginia worked around the clock, turning out new carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The Essex-class fleet carriers, larger, faster, and more resilient than anything afloat, were rolling off the slips in staggering numbers. In 1942, the U.S. Navy had only a handful of operational carriers. By 1944, it commanded more than 24, each capable of launching over 100 aircraft, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and fast battleships. What had once been a cautious, reactive fleet was transforming into a mobile, strike-oriented machine, designed not to hold territory, but to erase it. Japan watched in disbelief. Every intelligence report brought darker news. American radar was improving, their fighter planes were faster, their bombs more accurate. Japanese airmen, still relying on visual spotting and manual coordination, faced an enemy that could fight by instruments at night and in any weather. Out of this industrial power grew a new doctrine, the idea of fast carrier task forces, capable of moving thousands of miles, striking with overwhelming air power, and vanishing before the enemy could respond. The architect of this revolution was Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, a quiet, sharp-eyed veteran of naval aviation. His command style was calm, methodical, but decisive. He understood the carrier not as a single ship, but as the heart of a living organism, one that required constant coordination between pilots, deck crews, engineers, and supply lines stretching across the Pacific. By early 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, organized its striking arm into Task Force 58, the most powerful naval formation in history. Under Mitcher's tactical command, TF-58 would consist of multiple carrier groups, each centered around 2 to 4 carriers, screened by cruisers, destroyers, and fast battleships. Each group could operate independently or combine for massive coordinated attacks. The goal was simple but revolutionary: maintain continuous offensive pressure. When one task group was refueling, another was striking. When one was repairing, another was launching hundreds of aircraft over enemy airfields. It was the art of mechanical warfare applied to the sea, fluid, relentless, and self-sustaining. Japan's navy, exhausted and scattered, had nothing comparable. The once feared Kido Butai, the mobile striking force that had crushed Pearl Harbor, now existed only in memory. From the U.S. perspective, this was more than revenge. It was the beginning of a new era in naval warfare, one where steel decks replaced battleships, and the sky became the true battlefield. By the winter of 1943-44, the stage was set. The target, the Marshall Islands, a stepping stone toward the inner defenses of Japan, and leading that assault, for the first time, would be Task Force 58. The Japanese would soon realize that this was not merely another American attack. It was a storm born of industry, intelligence, and innovation, a storm they could neither predict nor stop. In early 1944, as the U.S. Navy prepared to seize the Marshall Islands, the full machinery of Task Force 58 began to move. The Pacific Ocean, once dominated by Japanese fleets, now echoed with the roar of American engines, tankers, destroyers, and carriers moving in perfect synchronization. At the top stood Admiral Raymond Spruance, a reserved strategist whose calm intellect contrasted sharply with the fiery Admiral William Bull Halsey. Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet, and under him, Admiral Mark Mitcher led the operational hammer, the fast carriers grouped as Task Force 58. Mitcher was not a man of speeches. He preferred clarity, precision, and quiet confidence. He had learned the hard lessons of Midway and Guadalcanal, that control of the air decided control of the sea. His task force would ensure that Japan never controlled the air again. To do this, Mitcher relied on something no navy in history had possessed, a logistical network without limits. Behind the carriers sailed an invisible lifeline. Hundreds of supply ships, oilers, repair vessels, ammunition barges, and floating workshops. Together they formed the mobile service force, an innovation that allowed the fleet to remain at sea indefinitely. No longer did the U.S. Navy need to retreat to Pearl Harbor after every operation. It could move forward, island by island, constantly refueled, constantly rearmed. This was war as industry, projected thousands of miles from home. Each carrier group within Task Force 58 was a self-contained war machine. Carrier Group 1, led by USS Essex and Intrepid, would strike the main targets. Group 2, built around Bunker Hill and Cowpens, provided fighter cover and reconnaissance. Group 3 and 4, with Yorktown, Lexington, Enterprise, and Princeton, roamed ahead to hunt remaining Japanese air power. In total, over 800 aircraft, supported by 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, and more than 40 destroyers. It was a navy within a navy, fast, flexible, and unstoppable. While the Americans prepared, Japanese intelligence was faltering. Communications intercepts were confused, reconnaissance flights sporadic. The Imperial Navy had grown thin, its skilled pilots replaced by hastily trained recruits with little combat experience. The radar systems protecting Japan's island fortresses were primitive, often unreliable under tropical conditions. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, the first major assaults of 1944, Task Force 58 demonstrated its new doctrine. Before the Marines ever set foot on the beaches, waves of carrier aircraft obliterated airfields, gun emplacements, and shipping. Every Japanese plane that tried to rise was cut down by F-6F Hellcats, whose speed and rugged design gave them total dominance over the nimble but fragile Zero fighters. The effect was devastating, not just militarily, but psychologically. For the first time, Japanese troops on remote islands realized that they could no longer expect help from the sea. Their skies belonged to the Americans. After the Marshalls fell, Spruance and Mitcher turned their eyes westward, toward Truk Lagoon, Japan's most heavily fortified naval base outside the home islands. It was often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, home to cruisers, destroyers, and a maze of airstrips and supply depots. Japanese officers believed Truk to be untouchable. Protected by reefs and anti-aircraft batteries, it was considered too distant for carrier raids. But Mitcher had other plans. His carriers now had the range, speed, and intelligence to strike anywhere. In February 1944, Task Force 58 slipped out of the Marshalls under radio silence. The operation was given a name, Hailstone. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. Their radar coverage was minimal, their pilots unready. By the time they detected the approaching wave, it would already be too late. For the defenders at Truk, February 17th would begin like any other day, humid, quiet, almost peaceful. But within hours, their entire world would disappear under fire and steel. As dawn broke and the alarms began to sound, they would finally meet the full fury of Carrier Task Force 58 and understand what modern war truly meant. The technological angle. The machine that ruled the Sea Task Force 58 was more than a fleet. It was a moving city of war, powered by the latest American technology. Each Essex-class carrier stretched over 870 feet, with elevators that could raise aircraft from hangar to flight deck in seconds. Beneath their armored decks, vast hangars buzzed with engineers, loaders, and armorers, men who worked in oily heat to prepare a constant stream of aircraft for launch. Above them, air groups operated with an efficiency born from brutal experience. The F-6F Hellcat, a machine of pure practicality, had become the symbol of this new era. Built by Grumman's Iron Works, it was fast, rugged, and forgiving, a fighter that could dive faster, climb higher, and survive hits that would have torn a Zero apart. Its .650 caliber machine guns shredded Japanese formations. Its pilots, guided by radar direction from the carriers below, could intercept attackers long before they neared the fleet. The Japanese still relied on visual scouting. The Americans now fought with electronic eyes. Even the sea itself was tamed by machinery. Oilers performed underway refueling, a delicate ballet of hoses and steel, keeping the carriers fueled without ever returning to port. Supply ships brought bombs, food, and spare parts. The fleet became a living organism, self-sustaining in the middle of the ocean. To the Japanese, it appeared as if the Americans had endless ships, endless planes, endless men. To the Americans, it was simply logistics turned into warfare, a war fought not just by sailors, but by the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle. The human angle. The men behind the machines beneath the technological marvel lay the human cost. Tens of thousands of men, each living in a world of constant noise, sweat, and danger. Aboard the carriers, the air smelled of aviation fuel and hot steel. Flight deck crews, known as the deck gang, worked in colored jerseys, each representing a role. Yellow for directors, blue for handlers, green for catapult crews, red for ordnance. Every takeoff and landing was a gamble. One mistake could send a plane into the sea or ignite a fire that could consume the entire ship. Pilots faced a different terror. They launched into the endless blue, often flying 6 to 8 missions a day. Many returned to find their carriers hidden by smoke or storms, running low on fuel as dusk fell. Some ditched in the waves, waiting for rescue planes that might never come. For Japanese defenders, it was worse. Their pilots were often barely trained, their aircraft outdated, their fuel scarce. Many were ordered to fight to the death. From their cockpits, they saw not 1 or 2 enemy carriers, but an entire horizon filled with them. A wall of American steel and smoke. Reports from Japanese officers described the raids in almost spiritual terms. The sky was filled with enemy planes. They came like a thunderstorm that would not end. The psychological divide was immense. American crews fought as part of an organized system, confident in their machines, their comrades, and the fleet's ability to recover them. Japanese airmen fought alone, often knowing they could not return. War in the Pacific was no longer a duel of samurai. It had become a duel of civilizations, fought with technology, discipline, and endurance. The tactical angle. Precision through overwhelming force. The power of Task Force 58 was not only in numbers but in coordination. Each strike was calculated with machine-like precision. Radar operators aboard cruisers and carriers tracked enemy positions miles away. Air controllers issued bearings and altitude instructions over radio. Deck crews timed launches so that waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes reached their targets simultaneously. Before every operation, briefing rooms were filled with maps, model ships, and flight plans. Every squadron had its role. The Hellcats cleared the skies, the Helldivers struck ships in airfields, and the Avengers torpedoed any vessel still afloat. Within minutes, the Japanese defenders would be overwhelmed from above, unable to mount a coordinated response. In these operations, Mitcher demonstrated a unique genius. He believed in saturation strikes, hitting not one target but all targets at once. It denied the enemy any chance to regroup or recover. By the time the first bombs fell on Truk, Japanese communications were collapsing. Airfields were burning, hangars shredded, ships exploding in the lagoon. Mitcher's pilots circled back, launching second and third strikes, ensuring no survivors could escape. The tactic was simple: strike fast, strike hard, never stop. It was an evolution of naval warfare. Speed and precision replacing armor and gun caliber. The old idea of battleships dueling at close range was dead. The future of war lay in the air, in formations of aircraft guided by radar and radio, fighting enemies they could barely see. And in the center of it all, calm and watchful on his flagship USS Lexington, Admiral Mitscher observed the pattern forming across the sea, the rhythm of industrial war. The Japanese still believed they were fighting a naval campaign. Task Force 58 was fighting a systematic annihilation. The enemy angle, facing the unimaginable. For Japan, the arrival of Task Force 58 was not simply a military event. It was a revelation of helplessness. The Japanese Empire, once drunk on victory, suddenly faced an enemy that fought on a different scale. At Truk Lagoon, radar operators watched as their screens filled with static, hundreds of signals converging at once. The men inside those bunkers had no concept of what was coming. They had grown used to American raids of a few dozen planes. They were not prepared for an armada in the sky. When the first bombs began to fall, communication lines went silent. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire blindly into the clouds. Sailors ran to man guns, only to find their ships already burning. Reports from survivors of the raid describe an eerie sense of unreality. The sky filled with aircraft from horizon to horizon, bombs falling in rhythmic waves. One officer aboard the cruiser Agano recalled, "It was like the sky itself had turned against us. The speed of the attack left no time for counteraction. Every Japanese aircraft that managed to take off was hunted down by swarms of Hellcats. Those who tried to escape by sea were cut apart by dive bombers. Within hours, Truk, once the proud symbol of Japanese naval might, became a graveyard." Even far from the battle, the psychological tremor spread through the Imperial Navy. Officers in Tokyo pored over after-action reports and could scarcely believe the scale of the destruction. The Americans had struck deep into the heart of Japan's defensive network, and then vanished untouched. To the Japanese military mind, trained in notions of honor, endurance, and sacrifice, this kind of warfare felt alien, cold, mechanical, unstoppable. No courage could stand against radar. No Bushido could intercept 1,000 planes at once. Fear crept into the Imperial Navy's soul. They began to whisper that the Americans were no longer men, but machines. Faceless, endless, coming from the sea like a force of nature. The leadership angle, Mitscher's quiet command. The center of this unfolding storm stood Admiral Mark Mitscher, an unlikely symbol of overwhelming power. He was a man who spoke little and smiled less, preferring efficiency over spectacle. His crew called him the Old Man, though he was only in his mid-50s. His office aboard the USS Lexington was bare, his manner calm. Yet from that calm emerged precision on a scale the world had never seen. Mitscher understood the new reality of war. He knew that victory in the Pacific would not come from heroics, but from organization, from the ability to maintain continuous momentum, day after day, raid after raid, without faltering. He delegated ruthlessly, trusted his subordinates, and demanded coordination above all else. The thousands of men under his command learned to act as one organism. A pilot crash landing into the sea could expect to be rescued within hours by a submarine or seaplane already stationed along his route. A damaged carrier could be replaced within days by another fresh from the U.S. West Coast. His superiors recognized his quiet genius. Admiral Spruance relied on Mitscher's aggression, while Admiral Halsey later called him a man who could make the impossible seem routine. Yet Mitscher carried the weight of command silently. After each major strike, he read casualty reports alone in his cabin. Hundreds of Japanese dead, dozens of American pilots missing. He knew that the power he wielded, the ability to erase entire bases in a single morning, came at a cost no human could fully grasp. When reporters later called him a hero, he simply said, "The men who fly the planes are the heroes. I just make sure they can do their job." His leadership was not about glory. It was about control, about ensuring that the machine of war ran without emotion, without failure. That detachment, essential for victory, also became the defining moral dilemma of the age. The moral angle, the weight of mechanized war. Devastation wrought by Task Force 58 forced both sides to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between strategy and annihilation was disappearing. For Japan, the raids on Truk and the Marshalls marked the beginning of defensive despair, a recognition that their empire could no longer protect its soldiers, its ships, or even its civilians. For the United States, it was the moment when war ceased to be personal. The enemy was no longer a visible opponent. It was a target on a map. From high above, American pilots saw only flashes of gunfire and clouds of smoke. They returned to their carriers to be fed, rearmed, and sent out again. Below them, thousands of men died unseen. One U.S. intelligence officer later wrote, "We had perfected the art of killing from a distance. We didn't hate them. We didn't even see them." This was modern warfare distilled to its essence, efficiency over emotion. Mitcher's fleet was not driven by hatred but by process. Every target destroyed, every ship sunk, was one step closer to ending the war. But in doing so, the Americans also crossed into a new era, one where technology and industrial output determined victory, and humanity became a secondary consideration. In the burning lagoons of Truk, the Japanese realized they could not match such power. In the steel corridors of the American carriers, sailors began to realize that they had become part of something larger, something unstoppable, but also something inhuman. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of warriors. It was a proving ground for the future of total war, fought by systems, not souls. As Task Force 58's aircraft disappeared into the western sky, the smoke over Truk still rose like a warning to the world. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay the greatest test of all, when Japan would try one last time to challenge American air supremacy in open battle. That moment would come only months later, in the skies over the Philippine Sea, but before that, Task Force 58 would deliver its most devastating demonstration yet, the day the Japanese called their own Pearl Harbor. Operation Hailstone, the shattering of Truk, February 17, 1944, Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. The morning began in calm silence. Tropical winds rustled through palm trees. Japanese sentries, unaware of what approached, watched the glimmering horizon with weary eyes. For months, Truk had been quiet, too quiet. Tokyo had promised reinforcements, but none had come. Supplies were thin, morale thinner. Then, just after sunrise, a faint rumble echoed across the lagoon. Some thought it was distant thunder, but as the seconds passed, the rumble deepened, turning into a steady roar that seemed to rise from the ocean itself. Radar operators scrambled to their scopes. At first, there were only a few signals, then dozens, then hundreds. The screens glowed with swarming echoes, a living storm converging from the northeast. The officer in charge hesitated only a moment before shouting into the phone, "Air raid! Air raid! This is not a drill!" Within minutes, the sky darkened with specks of movement. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, hundreds of them, sweeping in organized waves. The lead fighters dove first, strafing anti-aircraft positions and radar stations. Explosions tore through fuel tanks and gun emplacements. The first bombs struck the airfields at Eton and Moen, shattering runways before a single Japanese plane could take off. From the decks of the carriers miles away, the scene looked like a painting of destruction. Great plumes of black smoke rose from the lagoon as Mitcher's pilots struck every visible target. Japanese aircraft burned where they stood, dozens destroyed before ever leaving the ground. By 10 a.m., the raid had expanded. Waves of TBF Avengers swept in low over the water, dropping torpedoes into the clustered fleet anchored inside the lagoon. The cruiser Katori, the destroyer Fumizuki, and several auxiliary ships took direct hits. Ammunition depots exploded in rolling fireballs that rippled across the harbor. For hours, the assault continued without pause. The carriers maintained a perfect rhythm: launch, recover, refuel, relaunch. Deck crews worked like clockwork, their movements rehearsed through months of drills. Aircraft landed slick with salt and oil, rearmed in minutes and hurled back into the sky. By mid-afternoon, the lagoon was chaos. Ships sank at anchor, some capsizing, others burning to the waterline. Pilots reported seeing men leaping into flaming oil slicks, swimming through water that glowed with gasoline fire. The Japanese defense was fragmented, disorganized, desperate. One Japanese officer later wrote, The enemy came with such precision, such endless power, that it seemed as if the sea itself had opened to devour us. Mitchell watched the battle unfold from his flagship, USS Lexington. Calm, focused, he issued brief orders through his staff. Continue the strike. Maintain intervals. To him, this was not vengeance, it was procedure. Every explosion, every sinking followed the cold arithmetic of modern warfare. By sunset, Task Force 58 had launched over 1,200 sorties in a single day. Nearly 40 Japanese ships were sunk or crippled. More than 250 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. Night fell over a sea of burning wreckage. The lagoon flickered with orange light as fuel and ammunition continued to explode. Japanese soldiers on the islands huddled in bomb craters, dazed, waiting for an attack that would never stop. To the Americans, it was a triumph of planning and execution. To the Japanese, it was the end of illusion. Truk, once the impregnable fortress of the South Seas, there was gone. The next morning, February 18th, the strikes resumed. Mitchell ordered follow-up raids to finish what remained. Japanese survivors attempted to flee in small craft, only to be hunted down by patrol aircraft. The lagoon became a graveyard. Dozens of ships lying in shallow water, visible even from the air. When the smoke finally cleared, the scale of the devastation stunned even American intelligence officers. Photographs showed a lagoon filled with twisted metal and oil slicks stretching for miles. The Imperial Navy had lost a logistics base that could never be replaced. One U.S. officer described it simply. It was Pearl Harbor in reverse. Truk had been the beating heart of Japan's Pacific operations. In 2 days, Task Force 58 had cut that heart out. But for Mitchell, this was only the beginning. The success at Truk proved that the fast carrier concept worked, that a fleet of mobile airfields could project power across oceans. The next step would test that theory on an even grander scale. Beyond Truk lay the Mariana Islands, and the greatest air-sea battle the world had ever seen. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by mid-1944, the Pacific had become an American ocean. The Marshall Islands had fallen. Truk lay in ruins. Now Task Force 58 advanced toward the Mariana Islands, the final stepping stone to Japan's inner defense zone. If the Americans captured Saipan, they would possess airfields close enough for the new B-29 superfortresses to strike Tokyo itself. For Japan, this could not be allowed. The Imperial Navy, though crippled, still possessed the first mobile fleet, commanded by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft. On paper, it looked formidable, but beneath that surface was weakness, half-trained pilots, unreliable aircraft, and a crippling shortage of fuel. Against them stood Task Force 58, now larger than ever, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and more than 900 aircraft. Admiral Mitchell's fleet moved under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose mission was simple: cover the landings on Saipan and destroy whatever came to stop them. In June 1944, the 2 greatest carrier fleets in history sailed toward each other. The trap opens at dawn on June 19th. American radar screens aboard the carriers Lexington, Enterprise, and Hornet began to light up with incoming signals. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were approaching from the west. 4 attack waves coming straight for the U.S. fleet. The Americans were ready. Radar-guided fighter direction officers calculated intercept courses and relayed them to squadrons already climbing into the sun. Over 200 F-6F Hellcats rose to meet the attackers long before they came within visual range. The sky above the Philippine Sea erupted into chaos. The first Japanese wave, Zeros escorting bombers, broke apart under disciplined American fire. Hellcats dove through the formations, guns blazing, leaving trails of smoke and flame. Within minutes, the Japanese formation disintegrated. Out of 69 attacking planes, only a handful broke through the defensive screen, and none scored a direct hit. The second, third, and fourth waves met the same fate. American radar, fighter coordination, and superior aircraft turned what Japan hoped would be a decisive counterstrike into a massacre. By noon, the sea around Task Force 58 was littered with burning wreckage. Japanese pilots, most of them barely out of training, plunged into the waves or vanished in mid-air. One American pilot later said, "It was like a turkey shoot, they just kept coming." The name stuck. That day became known as The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Mitcher's decision. By evening, Mitcher had a choice to make. Reconnaissance planes had located the remnants of the Japanese fleet retreating westward. Night was falling. Launching a strike at dusk was risky. Aircraft would have to find and attack in darkness, then attempt to return and land by night on moving carriers. It was a gamble no admiral had ever attempted, but Mitcher understood momentum. He looked at the horizon, then simply said, "Launch the strike." As the sun sank into the sea, more than 200 American aircraft roared off the decks, Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats, their silhouettes vanishing into the twilight. Hours later, they found Ozawa's fleet. In a chaotic night battle lit by tracer fire and burning ships, the Americans struck hard. The Japanese carriers Hyo, Zuikaku, and Chiyoda were hit repeatedly. Explosions tore through decks and hangars. The Hyo sank in flames, taking hundreds of men with her. Then came the hardest part, the return. One by one, the American planes found themselves lost in the dark, low on fuel, searching desperately for their carriers. Seeing their plight, Mitcher made a fateful decision. He ordered, "Turn on the lights." Against every rule of naval warfare, the vast American fleet illuminated itself in the darkness. Deck lights, signal lamps, even searchlights, turning the sea into a glowing beacon to guide their pilots home. All night, exhausted aviators followed the faint glow of safety. Some crashed into the water. Others landed on the wrong decks, but hundreds made it back. Deck crews pulled them from cockpits and hauled them below as new waves of aircraft touched down. By dawn, the full scale of the victory became clear. Japan had lost 3 carriers, over 400 aircraft, and more than 300 pilots, the core of its remaining naval air strength. America lost barely 24 planes in combat. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was finished. The end of the Kido Butai. When reports reached Tokyo, shock gave way to silence. The Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had once burned Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific, was no more. The Imperial Navy would never again launch a large-scale carrier offensive. From that point forward, Japan's strategy collapsed into desperation. Kamikaze attacks, suicide missions, and futile defenses. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Task Force 58 now ruled the Pacific. Its steel decks and endless squadrons symbolized a new kind of war, one that Japan could not match and could barely comprehend. For Admiral Mitcher and his men, victory came not with celebration, but with quiet exhaustion. The sea was calm again, the horizon empty. Yet beneath that calm lay the certainty that the war's end, terrible and final, was approaching. The skies over the Philippine Sea marked the end of Japan's naval air power and the birth of America's dominance in the Pacific. But what came next would show the full consequences of that dominance, the aftermath of victory, the psychological toll, and the shadow it cast across the rest of the war. The Sea of Silence. When the sun rose over the Philippine Sea on June 20th, 1944, it revealed a sight few had ever imagined. Scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean were the burning remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy, twisted steel, drifting life rafts, and oil slicks spreading like ink across the calm blue surface. American search planes circled above, photographing the wreckage. The sea was strangely quiet, except for the soft hiss of burning oil and the cries of survivors clinging to debris. The once proud Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was gone. Its carriers, symbols of Japan's might, now lay beneath the waves. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, the mood was not of celebration but disbelief. Many pilots were too exhausted to even comprehend what they had done. They had fought for hours, often against invisible enemies guided only by instruments and instinct. Some had seen their friends vanish into the sea. Others returned to decks lit like runways in heaven, unsure if they had survived by skill or luck. For Admiral Mark Mitcher, victory was quiet. Standing on the bridge of the USS Lexington, he watched the empty horizon with folded arms. He did not smile. He simply said, "The Japanese fleet is broken." His tone was not triumphant. It was final. Strategic shock in Tokyo. The shock was devastating. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the empire, now faced an unbridgeable gap. Only a few carriers remained operational, and without trained pilots they were little more than floating targets. The loss of over 400 aircraft and hundreds of veteran aviators in the Philippine Sea meant Japan no longer possessed the means to contest air superiority. The defeat forced Emperor Hirohito's staff to confront a truth long avoided. Japan could no longer win a war of attrition. Its fuel reserves were nearly gone, its shipyards bombed, and its replacement pilots were barely out of flight school. In private memos, naval staff officers described the situation as beyond recovery. The fleet's remnants withdrew to the homeland, hoping to defend what little remained. But the skies now belonged to the Americans. The ascendancy of the carrier's Task Force 58's victory also transformed the very nature of naval warfare. Before the war, battleships had ruled the seas. But after Truk and the Philippine Sea, it was clear. The aircraft carrier was now king. Mitcher's fast carrier task force had proven that mobility, coordination, and overwhelming air power could destroy even the most fortified enemy strongholds. No fleet, no base, no island was safe from its reach. American planners seized the momentum. The path to Japan now lay open through the Marianas, the Palaus, and eventually Leyte Gulf. From newly captured Saipan B-29, super fortresses began taking off near their destination, Tokyo. The war that Japan had once brought to American shores was now coming home to them. Human cost and silent victories for the men who served aboard. Task Force 58. The aftermath brought a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. They had accomplished what few thought possible, annihilating Japan's naval air power in a single campaign. Yet the human cost was staggering. Hundreds of American airmen never returned. Some crashed in the dark after Mitcher's daring night strike. Others vanished into the endless Pacific, their names recorded only on rolls of the missing. Ships held memorial services on their decks. Pilots stood silently as chaplains read the names of those lost. Wreaths of flowers drifted across the same waters where enemy ships still burned. The war had entered a new phase, one of overwhelming dominance for the United States and of despair for Japan. But beneath the numbers and victories, every sailor and pilot understood one truth: the worst was yet to come. Because ahead lay the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, battles that would test the human spirit more than any fleet engagement ever could. Task Force 58 had become the hammer of the Pacific, an unstoppable force that shattered everything it struck. But as its pilots and sailors looked toward the next campaign, they knew the cost of victory was mounting with every mile closer to Japan. Collapse of the Imperial Navy. The months that followed the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its aircraft carriers, once the pride of the empire, now floated uselessly at anchor, stripped of fuel, aircraft, and hope. Many were ordered to remain in port as decoys, their decks empty, their engines silent. Japan's shipyards could no longer produce enough steel or fuel to rebuild. Allied submarines choked the sea lanes, cutting off supplies from the Dutch East Indies. Every tanker sunk tightened the noose around Japan's war machine. When the Americans began their Philippine campaign later that year, Japan's naval command gambled on one last desperate stand, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. But the truth was cruelly simple. Without air cover, the Japanese fleet was blind. Task Force 58 and its land-based air support shredded wave after wave of attacking ships. Carriers like the Zuikaku and Zuiho were sunk, battleships were crippled, and entire task groups were annihilated. The last remnants of the once mighty combined fleet scattered into history. Never again would Japan's Navy sail to challenge the Americans in open battle. The weight of command for Admiral Mark Mitcher, victory brought little relief. He had led the most powerful fleet the world had ever seen, yet he carried the weight of every decision. Every pilot who didn't return from the night strike, every ship lost to misfortune or human error. After the war, his officers described him as a man haunted by success. He rarely spoke of his achievements, preferring instead to credit his crews and pilots. To Mitcher, Task Force 58's triumph was not about glory. It was about precision, discipline, and sacrifice. Behind his calm demeanor lay the heavy knowledge that power of such scale could annihilate entire cities. and soon would. Psychological ruin in Japan array. Japanese public never learned the full truth of the carrier losses. Wartime propaganda softened the blow, referring to the Philippine Sea as a temporary setback. But among military circles, the despair was total. Veteran pilots who survived the battle returned home to empty barracks and half-trained replacements. They spoke in hushed tones about the endless waves of American planes, the radar-guided coordination, the impossibility of surviving against such force. Younger cadets began to whisper a phrase that spread like a shadow through flight schools. "We cannot win." By late 1944, Japanese Naval Command turned to the unthinkable: kamikaze attacks, the use of human lives as weapons. The birth of this desperate tactic was, in many ways, the direct child of Task Force 58's success. The skies no longer offered Japan any hope of victory, only martyrdom, the industrial tide. The contrast between the two nations could not have been greater. While Japan's shipyards lay silent, American factories were at full roar. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 28 fleet and light carriers, 40 escort carriers, and over 18,000 naval aircraft. For every Japanese carrier sunk, 3 new American ones arrived to replace it. For every pilot lost, another squadron trained in California or Florida waited to take his place. Task Force 58 became the symbol of that industrial tide, a fleet that could not be exhausted. No matter how far it sailed, it never ran out of planes, ammunition, or men. For the Japanese observers who glimpsed it from their dying bases, it seemed less like a fleet and more like a machine, endless, inevitable, and inhumanly powerful. The ocean of wrecks. By the end of 1944, the Pacific was filled with graves. Beneath the waves lay the skeletons of ships from both sides: the Shokaku, the Zuikaku, the Hiyo, the Katori, the Yamato soon to follow. Coral grew over gun turrets. Fish swam through rusted hangars. What had once been the arena of empire was now an underwater memorial to ambition and ruin. American crews sailing past the wrecks often stared silently over the rails. They knew what they had done. They had broken the enemy, but in doing so, they had seen the face of modern war. Victory achieved not by courage alone, but by overwhelming force, technology, and numbers. Task Force 58 had rewritten the rules of naval warfare and crushed Japan's last hope of parity. Yet in the quiet after the storm, as the fleet turned its eyes toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, even its victors began to wonder, if this was the cost of domination, what would peace look like? The dawn beyond the smoke. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Pacific lay transformed. The ocean that had once echoed with the thunder of fleets now shimmered in quiet reflection. Beneath its surface slept the wrecks of empires, reminders of a time when courage alone could not stand against the weight of machines. Task Force 58 had done more than win battles. It had rewritten the very nature of war. Before it, power had meant territory, armies marching, battleships dueling. After it, power became projection, the ability to launch destruction from hundreds of miles away, invisible until it struck. The aircraft carrier was no longer just a ship. It was a mobile nation carrying its own sky, its own army, its own horizon. For the men who served on those decks, the memory lingered for decades. The heat of jet fuel, the rhythm of engines, the endless expanse of blue, and the knowledge that every launch carried both victory and death in its shadow. They had been young, confident, and unstoppable. Yet in quiet moments, many admitted they felt a deep unease, that in mastering the art of destruction, humanity had stepped into a new and uncertain world. Because Task Force 58 was not just the symbol of American power, it was the herald of the future, of global reach, of technological dominance, of wars fought beyond the sight of those who suffered their consequences. In 1944, Japanese sailors stared in disbelief as the sky filled with American planes. They called it impossible. They called it inhuman. And in a way, they were right. Task Force 58 was not born of hatred, but of necessity. Yet its shadow stretched far beyond the Pacific. From its steel decks began the age of the superpower, the jet, and the bomb, the tools that would shape the rest of the 20th century. And so, the story of Task Force 58 ends where modern warfare truly begins. Not in the roar of engines, but in the silence that followed.